Good evening. My name is Aaron Urbanzik. I am the Dean of our School of Arts and Sciences here at Aquinas, and I'm very pleased to see you all here this evening to join me in welcoming Mr. Michael Miller, who will be our speaker this evening. It is a distinct honor to welcome Mr. Michael Miller to Aquinas College as a contributor to the 2014 lecture series. Mr. Miller received his bachelor's degree from the University of Notre Dame, an MA from Nagoya University's Graduate School of International Development in Japan, a Master of Arts in Philosophy from the Franciscan University of Steubenville, and an MBA in International Management from the Thunderbird Graduate School of Global Business. Mr. Miller is currently the Research Fellow and Director of Acton Media at the Acton Institute, a very highly regarded institute dedicated to exploring issues of economics, politics, public policy, and social issues. Mr. Miller is a speaker of international reputation on issues related to economics, moral philosophy, and social theory. His writings frequently appear on the Acton Institute's website, and he has been published in the Washington Times, the Detroit News, and the LA Daily News. He has been recently involved in several very interesting and engaging media projects at the Acton Institute. I suspect you'll hear about some of them this evening, including the Poverty Cure DVD series, which probes the causes of global poverty and explores entrepreneurial situations that would assist developing parts of the world. He serves as a member of Sister Mary Sarah's President's Advisory Council here for Aquinas College in Nashville, and also sits on the board of the Dietrich von Hildebrand Legacy Project and the board of trustees for Angelico Press. Would you please join me in welcoming Mr. Michael Miller?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. So I'm delighted to be here. I usually like to begin with a prayer, so if you just join with me quickly. I'm going to do something slightly ecumenical here. This is a prayer of St. Francis, but you can join in, even if you're in a Dominican habit. So, O Lord and Master of my life, give us right faith, firm hope, perfect charity, with wisdom and perception, that we might do what is truly your holy will. So thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you, sisters, for inviting me here. I'm delighted to be back at Aquinas College in Nashville. It's freezing where I'm from, but the snow, it was the first day we've had sun in such a long time, so I think it's the first time in my life I've ever been sad to leave the snow, but there was sun there today, so it was exciting. I'm going to talk today about poverty, charity, and the institutions of justice. So concern for the poor is at the heart of Christianity. The Holy Father, Pope Francis, of course, has spoken of the need and the necessity that we care for the poor often in the last year. Blessed John Paul called poverty one of the greatest moral challenges of our time. So care for the poor is not an option. It's not something that we do. So, for example, that we choose to do. So, I'm into liturgy and I'm into poverty and I'm into these. No, that's not an option, right? Care for the poor is essential. St. James, in his epistle, really summarizes the gospel message when he writes, "Pure religion is this, to care for the widow and the orphan in their distress, and to keep ourselves unstained from the world." So we're called to be in the world, to care for, but not to be of it, to keep ourselves unstained. And sometimes I think, especially in the times in the last 50 years, there can be a tendency for us to focus on one or the other. So there are people who are interested in social justice, and there are people interested in doctrine and theology. But really, we are to be interested in all of these things, because any concern for justice that's going to flourish is right, especially if you're from the 80s or the 70s or the 60s. You remember that George H.W. Bush was always kind of mimicked about, not going to do it, wouldn't be prudent, right? And Clinton said, "I have never been prudent, never." Okay, anyway, so I appreciate prudence. Okay, anyway, so prudent, right? We have this idea that prudence is being careful, but that's not what prudence is. Prudence is seeing the world as it is and acting accordingly. And so, if you don't see the world as it is, you can't be just, and you can't have Because you can't be courageous or just if you're not actually seeing what's happening. So what happens is with charity is that imprudent charity, pardon me, imprudent charity can actually increase injustice. Okay? There's a famous activist, a rock star, who said, we have to do something even if it doesn't work. Okay? Now, of the sage. So we are called by God to have a heart for the poor. But we also must have a mind for the poor. And we must exercise our charity in justice. So what I'm going to do in this lecture is look at three things. First, I'm going to examine the dominant approach to charity and social justice and economic development, and argue that it has not been as successful as we have hoped. And that despite good intentions, in fact, has sometimes done harm. Okay, that's the first. Second, I will briefly discuss the underlying theological and philosophical problems with the current model of charity and development. And then third, I will argue that the biggest obstacle for today's poor is not merely a lack of material goods, okay? But that they are excluded from what John Paul has called the circles of exchange. That poor people lack the institutions of justice that enable them to create prosperity for their families and communities. So sometimes we look at poor people and we say, what can I do to help? And this is commendable. You have this reaction, like you're taken by this. What am I going to do to help? And that's an important question, but I don't think it's a better question. And the better question is, instead of what can I do to help, it's how can people in poverty, and I'm going to speak mostly about the developing world today, how do people in the developing world create prosperity for their families and their communities? And this tiny shift shifts the focus completely. It takes the focus off of me and puts the focus on where it belongs. Okay, and I'll talk about, I think, why that's important. But there's this sense, I've heard it many times, if North American Christians got together, we could raise $84 billion and we could eradicate poverty forever. No, we couldn't, ladies and gentlemen, because poverty is not about poor people not having enough stuff. You can't buy your way out of poverty. Poverty is about, primarily, in the developing world, it's different in the developed world, but in the developing world, primarily it's because millions of people are excluded from the institutions of justice that enable them to create prosperity for their families and their communities. All right, so let's talk a little bit about, in part one, the major social justice response to poverty, which I would call the foreign aid charity model. So the foreign aid charity model. Now, at the end of World War II and the breakup of colonialism, the dominant idea at the time was if we could just deploy large transfers of money from governments in the developed world to, in economies in the West, to governments in the developing world to build up infrastructure, electricity, education, etc., this would jumpstart the process of development and countries could make the leap into industrialism. And so these ideas, of course, came out of the context of World War II, the idea that we've won the war, now let's win the peace, and the intellectual fashion of the time of large-scale industrial plans and social engineering. However, as time has passed, if we look at it from a longer perspective, the success of the model comes into question. And that I would argue that this strategy, unintentionally, let me say this very clearly, I am not saying people are bad. I'm not saying that there are malicious people. I mean, of course, there are malicious people. There are some people who are out just to take advantage of the poor. But most of the people who work in trying to help poverty are not malicious. However, I would argue that this strategy and the incentives has created a poverty industry. And it's very complex. But like other industries, part of the poverty industry is to stay in business, right? And if poor people get out of poverty, then there's no more poverty industry, okay? So there's a lot of players, lots of overlapping incentives, which I won't go into. But let me examine just a couple approaches to helping the poor within this system, okay? The first one is foreign aid. Now, while there have been some individual successful aid initiatives, for instance, some of the early response to the Indian Ocean tsunami saved lives. At the same time, if we look at the overall track record of government to government transfers, which is what foreign aid is, it's government to government transfers, the record is mixed at best. The National Bureau of Economic Research has found little to no correlation between aid and development. So in the introduction, I mentioned that I've been working on this project called Poverty Cure, which has been very interesting. My colleagues and I have done about 150 interviews all over the world, experts in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and it's offered some insights into how aid can actually create harm. A Senegalese businessman put it this way: aid has delayed the development of business in Africa. It has kept Africa behind, he said. Why? Because when foreign aid is given, it can often replace or crowd out local businesses, right? So if foreign aid, if you're going to have if a big aid project comes in, there are local businesses who may be trying to do some of that same industry, and foreign aid can crowd out those local businesses. It makes it hard for them to develop because they become reliant on aid. Even worse, aid often becomes linked with big businesses and ends up feeding crony capitalism, right? Where big business, powerful interest groups, and entrenched political bureaucracies collude with one another to gain advantages. And these lock out smaller local businesses. So Ghanaian businessman Herman Chinere Hesse, I was talking to him, he said, look, 5 companies got together and we were bidding for a project. And we were competent to do the work. Herman founded a company called SoftTribe, which does tropically tolerant software. So it's software that works in the developing world where there's electricity outages and all these types of things. So he and 5 other companies got together and they bid for a project. And everything was going well. And their competitor of the bid was a European company. And what happened is the European company got their government to make a soft loan to Ghana. And the Ghanaian government said, look, we love you guys, but nothing beats free money. He said, we lost our business. And they ended up actually getting contracted, right, to do even some of the parts of the work. He said, so their government paid, we did the work, and they took the money. That's not aid, that's not assistance, that's thuggery. I was talking to another man, Theodore Dalrymple, and I told him this story. He said, of course. It's fantastic. And I have all this on video, so it's even more interesting. But he said, oh, yes, I've worked on such projects. I worked on road projects in Tanzania. The waste was incredible. He said, these companies never could have gotten a contract in a real market. But because of this crony capitalist foreign aid money going back and forth, they were able to get markets. Able to get these big contracts. And these, he said, can amount to hundreds of millions of dollars. He said, I myself worked on this project. And he said, and the money goes from the tax dollars into the governments, European and American governments, United Nations, World Bank, gets sent over to the governments of the developing world, who then contract to a company in Europe or the United States. And so he said, I bought my first home on the proceeds of aid. Aid's been very good to me, enabled me to have a good life, to travel, pay no tax. Couldn't be better. So the question is, who's actually benefiting from the aid? Because we have this industry that's developed, and oftentimes big business and big government get connected. Let me give you some examples of this. So one is in the realm of agriculture. Here's what we do to the developing world. In Europe and the United States, we subsidize our farmers to so-called protect farmers. Now, actually, I interviewed an American farmer, a medium-sized farmer, does organic stuff. And he wrote a book, his name is Joel Salatin. He wrote a book called Everything I Want to Do is Illegal. Because there's so many rules and regulations that big agriculture and the government create that he said, I can't compete. So whether it's actually protecting farmers is another question. But the idea is we're going to protect farmers. So what we do is we overproduce. So we subsidize our agriculture, we overproduce, and then we ship the food to the developing world, either as foreign aid or we artificially affect tariffs. So the United States encourages another country to lower its tariffs in the name of free trade. Of course, we don't lower our tariffs in the name. Have you ever thought about like free trade agreements, right? They're like this thick. And how do you need a book this thick to have a free trade agreement? It's either free trade or it's not free trade. So what happens is we ship this food over, we disempower local farmers, we put them out of business, and then we blame free markets. Oh my goodness, look what free competition is doing to the poor. This isn't free markets, it's crony capitalism. So in order to protect the poor from these evil free markets, we then create rules and subsidies and regulations to protect the poor, when it was those rules and subsidies and regulations that hurt them in the first place. So it's not free competition that's hurting the poor, it's managerial, bureaucratic, crony capitalism that favors the poor, the rich and the well-connected. The Guardian newspaper reported that out of $1 billion in agricultural food aid in the United States, 70% of it went to 3 companies. Now I want to make a point. Foreign aid can be helpful and even necessary in times of great emergency, such as a natural disaster. But this is very short term. The problem with the foreign aid model, fundamentally, is not that we go in and we help people in need. The problem is that we've used this emergency model as the standard and the model for long-term economic development. In some ways, foreign aid has become the foundation for a new type of colonialism. I heard this one man told me, he was talking to a Haitian guy, and the Haitian guy said, first we had colonialism, then we had neo-colonialism, then we had neo-colonialism, and now we just have development, which is just another kind of colonialism. So what happens is there's this poverty industry that has developed. I've talked to people from all over the world, and they're like, they say, oh, it's totally a poverty industry. And this is what's happening. A lot of people in the developing world are experiencing our help as an industry of poverty. So before I go on with foreign aid, because that's just one aspect of it, I do think it becomes somewhat of a cornerstone of the way we deal with things, and I'll show you why in a little bit. But let me address one more thing before I move on. And beyond the problems of economics and kind of economic justice, there are other moral and justice questions with foreign aid. Often, grants or loans, aid grants or loans, are contingent upon the implementation of morally evil things. Most notably, population control programs, and increasingly, homosexual marriage. Right? And so you think, well, wait, homosexual marriage, let me just bracket on that. I'm not going to talk very much about that. But if you think about it, when the state tries to redefine a biological and sociological reality, when the state tries to redefine it, this is a usurpation of state power. I mean, it's really a totalitarian act. It's the state saying, you're going to obey. We're going to redefine reality, and you will obey. And this is a big problem. This is not about morality or legality of homosexual relationships. This question on marriage is about whether the state can redefine a biological and sociological reality and then require others to obey. It's a complete usurpation of the state's power. And the sky is now, green instead of blue. It's redefining reality. But let's go back to the other problem. I just want to make clear why it's this kind of forcing people to do these things is problematic. It just in the question of justice. But let's talk about population control programs. Western nations and international organizations often impose a Western secular and Enlightenment worldview. The very same thing that Benedict XVI critiqued in his Regensburg Address. If you have not read the Regensburg Address by Benedict XVI, it's not very long. It is absolutely important. I recommend it very highly. You can get it just on the Vatican website. Archbishop Charles Palmer Buckle of Ghana put it this way. He said that these organizations impose a culture of death instead of a civilization of love. In the Millennium Development Goals of the United Nations, number 4 is to improve maternal health, and this can include abortion. And in fact, some Catholic and Christian organizations have even signed on to the Millennium Development Goals. I'm not saying they're signing on to abortion, but they're signing on to the goals, and part of the goals include this. When President Obama took office, he reversed the Mexico City Agreement, and the United States government now funds abortions in the developing world. So over the last decade, Western governments and international organizations have spent billions of dollars promoting population control throughout the world. Despite the fact there's really no evidence that population is a cause of poverty. And if you want me to explain how this works, I'm happy to do that in Q&A, but I'm going to move on. People are not a burden People are the potential solution to poverty, since human beings have creative capacity to generate new wealth and opportunities. Right? So human economics is not a zero-sum game. Actually, let me give you a quick explanation. Let's say everybody took their money out, and we pooled our money right here. And then we divided the room in half, and half of us got killed. Okay? I'm a martyr for you guys. Okay? All right? And then we redistributed the money here to all the people who are alive. Would everybody be more well off? Yes, for a snapshot. But what happened is all the productive capacity of this side of the room is gone. So yes, for a moment, you go down the developing world and you see these, there's so many poor children. If there were fewer children, there'd be more money to go around. Yeah, sure, for a minute. But also the data is not clear. The data is it's quite clear that population is not a cause of poverty. Okay, there can be demographic issues and things, but instead there's really an ideology of population control. But let's think about it. It's actually it's worked. Because when you're encouraged to have small families, ladies and gentlemen, what type of child do you choose? If you're encouraged to have a small family, what type of child do you choose? You choose a boy. You choose males. You choose males. And so, let's see here. All right, so girls, what we found is that there has been an unprecedented change in the boy-girl ratio. And this is not only in China. Okay. We have what the New York Times has called the daughter deficit, and The Economist magazine has called gendercide. What happened to 100 million baby girls? So this shortage of girls will fuel a host of social ills. Not least of these is the rise of human trafficking. So the other problem with aid is that it's connected to a certain ideological worldview that imposes morally evil things on developing countries. If this is not colonialism or imperialism, I don't know what is. I spoke to a Guatemalan economist, a woman. She said, listen, it's bad enough that China does this to their own people, but that Europeans and Americans are funding and planning the murder of unborn brown and black baby girls throughout the world is unconscionable. It's morally evil, and we need to be attentive to this. So let me move on now, away from the foreign aid, into non-governmental organizations, or what are sometimes called NGOs. And these are another important player in the poverty industry. So non-governmental organizations, we tend to think of these as private, non-profit organizations with altruistic motives, and sometimes, of course, that's very true. But many NGOs, especially some of the large ones, get large amounts of funding from governments and international agencies. So I would argue that we think of them as non-governmental. I think it's better to understand many of them as, in fact, para-state organizations. That is, they are government-financed non-governmental organizations. Got it? GFNGO, government-financed non-governmental organizations. Let me give you one example. Catholic Relief Services, according to its own reporting, gets about 70% of its budget from government money. Now, this is not intrinsically wrong to get money from the government, but the question is whether it's prudent. At different points, this can create conflict between the interests of state and what the church is trying to do. So it reduces the independence. It can identify the church with U.S. foreign policy, which you don't want to identify with a specific foreign policy of the church. And it can also be an occasion for cooperation with evil, whether it's material or formal. And this especially comes into the questions of abortion and contraception. So something I think to think about. Also, like non-governmental organizations, like foreign aid, non-governmental organizations can crowd out local entrepreneurs. So Herman Chinua Hesse was a Ghanaian entrepreneur. I'll talk about that in a second. Who I told you about, he said, look, I'm about to start a business. An NGO gets whiff of it because it's topical. They get foreign aid money to provide it for free. And what happens to my staff? I have to lay off my staff. What happens to my business? So this man here is named Alex George. And Alex George and his business partner, Jean Ronel Noel, started a company in Haiti, in Port-au-Prince, that makes solar panels and lights. And so, first of all, how many people knew they made solar panels and lights in Haiti? But part of this has to do with fundamentally an image, like a broken image of how we see poor people, which I'll talk about in a minute. So these men hire people from a place called Cité Soleil and other poor neighborhoods. In 2006, Cité Soleil was ranked the most dangerous place on the planet by the United Nations. So they hire men from this area, and they're doing factory work. And we have actually, I'm directing a documentary that's going to come out later this year that will, we have beautiful footage of a lot of the work. So the problem is when NGOs ship in free solar panels, they actually make it hard for organizations and businesses like INERSA to compete. So Alex was telling us, he said, before the earthquake, INERSA was selling about 50 streetlights a month. After the earthquake, even though there was a demand for streetlights, because all the free stuff that came in, all the NGOs were sending free stuff in, they went from selling 50 streetlights a month to selling 5 streetlights within a 6-month period, because they just couldn't compete with free stuff. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if that company goes out of business, it's not the small, medium entrepreneur that's really going to be hammered. It'll be tough on him to start over. But it's the men who are fathers living in some of the poorest places in the world. And so we have to think about the unintended consequences. Is our help hurting? Is giving away free things good? I mean, this is sometimes, but oftentimes it can actually create harm. And this is not simply in NGOs. It's not simply in foreign aid. It's the problems of social entrepreneurs who often do basically very elegant, effective ways that sometimes even make things more. They're effective, old charity models that are made kind of hip and clever, and they end up doing the same thing just in a more effective and thereby sometimes even more harmful way. Right? So one of the problems too with this whole NGO and charity thing that we have to ask ourselves is, again, who's benefiting? Right? I've been around doing all these videos and get to go places, and you get to see these things. It's quite great. It's great. Okay. So we have to ask ourselves, as we engage in this, what's happening? And it's not only NGOs. It's not only foreign aid. It's not only social entrepreneurs. It's also Christian charity this can happen to. For example, Peter Greer, who's the president of Hope International, who does microfinance, and he told me a story that there was a church in Atlanta that wanted to give eggs to this community in Rwanda after the genocide. And of course, the genocide was a terrible thing. Completely destructive. And so this church went in. Again, that's why I'm pointing this again to reiterate. I'm not talking about the intentions of people. I'm not saying they're malicious. I'm not saying people are bad. I'm saying we have to think differently about the way we engage poverty. So this church went in to give eggs. What they didn't know is in that community there was a man named John. And John had actually started an egg business. And when the church came in, gave the eggs, John went out of business. And then the church said, okay, we've done our good work here. Let's go to another community and help them. But what happened is the capacity, internal capacity in that community was now gone, and that community actually had to get eggs from outside itself. Here's another example of unintended consequences. When I was in Haiti, I met Corrigan and Shelley Clay. And they're an American couple, and they went to adopt a Haitian child. And they decided they were going to start an orphanage. So they went down and had met this little boy, and they were going to adopt him. And the orphanage director said, would you like to meet the mother? And they said, okay. And you can imagine in an American situation, sometimes there's a young woman maybe, who just cannot take care of her child, who's giving the child up, and the parent wants to meet the parents of the adopted. So they said, okay, if she's okay with that. Said, oh no, she's fine. She comes and she visits the child, quite often and brings him things. So they watched this mother. They said, this is very strange. So they said, why are you giving up your child? She obviously loves the child. And the mother said, I don't have enough money. And Shelley, she said, it was this shock. I'm spending $20,000 to adopt a child that the mother wants? And they began to ask around. And this is not only their number. they discovered that about 80% of orphans in Haiti have parents. Parents who put their children in orphanages simply because they don't have enough money to take care of them. So they discovered that our charity model, our orphan care model, which is mostly done by Christians with a good heart to follow the commandment of the Bible, to take care of the widow and the orphan in their distress, ended up actually creating a system that incentivized orphans. So they went down with $30,000 to start an orphanage. They had got some inheritance. And instead, they said, what if we, she's kind of a crafty person and does these things. Not crafty in the sense of like shifty, but crafty. And they said, what if we started a business? And so they actually started a business. And they said, what if instead of helping children, we helped parents raise their children? So now they have 220 workers, and they make now more than $30,000 a month in income for their workers. And they're caring for about 700 children. And when I was there, I met a woman who had 5 children. She was about to give her child up, ended up getting a job with the Apparent Project, and now bought her own house and is taking care of her children. So what they did actually goes to a core principle in Catholic social teaching, which is the principle of subsidiarity. So here's a question. I don't have a strong position on this, but here's a question. Think of all the charities that focus on children. And sometimes children need to be cared for. Children always need to be cared for, but sometimes there are children who need care. And there are orphans. And I know people who are working with orphans, and they're orphans, and they need immediate assistance. Imagine if somebody came to you and said, look, you're on hard times now. You lost your job, everything's tough. I got an idea. I'll take your kids, and we'll put them in a really nice place. We'll give them good food and books and education, and maybe even adoption. What would you say? Well, what you'd say is, no, I just want a job so I can take care of my own children. So oftentimes we're missing this kind of key focus of how we engage with people. So these are some of the problems. There are more, but I won't burden you. So what I'd like to do is move now to the second part, which are the underlying problems with the dominant model of humanitarianism. And there's just 2 of them. One is what I would call the problem of charity. I would argue that the dominant idea of how we engage, here we go, how we engage with the poor is not charity. That the dominant way in which we engage with the poor is humanitarianism. And humanitarianism is a hollowed out, secular vision of Christian love. And that ultimately focuses on material needs. Charity, on the other hand, caritas, agape, is Christian love. So it is the intentio benevolentia. It is the desire, the intention, the will of the good of the other. It seeks the good of the other. Christian love, charity, seeks the good of the other. So the goal of charity, of course, is to what? To seek after the other person's good, thereby promote human flourishing and always keeping the eternal destiny of the person in mind. That famous line from C.S. Lewis, you've never met a mere mortal, Lewis writes. Civilizations are mortal, cultures are mortal, but it is immortals whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit. Immortal horrors or everlasting splendors. It is immortal horrors or everlasting splendors that we are engaging with. But in humanitarianism, because its horizons are limited by matter, humanitarianism doesn't see the person with an eternal destiny and doesn't see the person then in human flourishing, but only needs to be met. So authentic charity must be rooted in truth, and specifically the truth about the human person, or, as Benedict reminds us, it degenerates into sentimentality. So too often in our desire to help, we forget the inherent dignity and creative capacity of the poor. And that's why I said we often ask, how do I help, instead of how does this person create prosperity for his family and his community? And then how can I come alongside that person? So that's the first. You could go on a long time with that. But the second one is the distinction between subjects and objects. Another danger in missing this basic truth about people is that poor people become the objects of charity instead of the subjects and the protagonists of their own development. So Pope Francis has spoken about this in a presentation he gave in September 2009 as Cardinal Bergoglio. It's called Las Deudas Sociales, the social debts and obligations. He says, quote, "We cannot truly respond to the challenge of eradicating exclusion and poverty if the poor continue to be objects, targets of action by the state and other organizations in a paternalistic aid-based sense, instead of subjects in an environment where the state and society create the social conditions that promote and safeguard their rights and allow them to build their own destiny." So he identifies this core insight in how we should engage with the poor, that they are, in fact, subjects. And of course, let me give you a quick analogy, because I started a little late, so I don't want to go too long. But let me give you a quick analogy. This experience of subject and object, of course, is written beautifully by John Paul II. And what happens in the garden, you see this, right? This tendency to objectify people begins in the garden. So Adam is created, he's all alone. God says it's not good that he's alone. He's given all the animals, he's naming the animals, and nothing is satisfactory. Nothing is satisfactory. Finally, God makes Eve. And Adam sees Eve and he says, at last, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. So Cardinal Scola, in his book, The Nuptial Mystery, says, I think quite beautifully, that Adam sees in Eve identity and difference. Identity, the sameness, and difference. And in this difference, in this identity, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, and the difference comes an invitation to communion. And from this communion comes another person that God wills for its own sake. So I have 5 children. These children are not willed for my sake. They're willed for their own sake. Right? So there comes will for their own sake. So then the fall happens, right? And the Bible says, "You shall desire your husband and he will lord it over you." And what happens is the gaze of Adam now stops at difference and turns the subject into an object for his own gratification. And so analogously, and with less gravity, what's taking place is that we're objectifying poor people as objects of our charity. And this is obviously one of the dangers of sentimentality. What I'm saying is really related, I promise you. All right? So I think these are core underlying problems. And to be honest, this is why Christianity has to be the force in charity. It's always been the force in charity. Secular humanism is a copy of Christian charity. And so we are the big players in the room. And it's important that we do not imitate a bad copy of ourselves, but instead go back into our own tradition and exercise charity not in humanitarianism, but in agape, in Christian love. It is good that you are, says Joseph Pieper. That's what love is. Affirmation. It's good that you exist, and this promotion of human flourishing, or integral human development, as Benedict and others have called it. So this takes me to part 3, the last thing I'll talk about. And this is rethinking justice for the poor. One of the things that let me put it there so you don't have to read that. One of the things Pope Francis has stressed is that we must say no, quote, no to an economy of exclusion and inequality. And here he echoes Blessed John Paul, who wrote, quote, "Poverty in today's circumstances is primarily a matter of exclusion from networks of productivity and exchange. It is not to be understood simply or simplistically as a matter of having an unequal and inadequate portion of what is imagined to be a fixed number of economic goods," end quote. So there is no shortage of entrepreneurs in the developing world. Hernando de Soto has a beautiful line. He says, the developing world is teeming with entrepreneurs. People in poverty, people in the developing world are not somehow radically different from us. So the question then is, why don't they emerge? Why don't they emerge like they do in Europe or the US or South Korea? And there are many reasons. It's very complex. But one of them that's often ignored is that I would say they lack the institutions of justice. And I'm going to address 4 of them very quickly. And I'm also going to say that all of these institutions of justice, if you know Catholic social teaching and you know Thomas Aquinas, come out of the Christian tradition. So this is where, again, look, good Christians can disagree about a lot of things. But we have a great tradition that we need to bring to the table. And unfortunately, we don't sufficiently do that. We're almost like, well, can I come to the table? No, we own the table, okay? So let me say quickly. So one of them is lack of clear property title. Now, the thing you're going to notice, how many people know what Tom Shoes is? You know what Tom Shoes is? Okay. You know, Tom Shoes is kind of a hip movement. You buy one shoe, you give one to somebody in the developing world. There's some problems with it, but Tom Shoes, that's exciting, right? Let's sponsor a child, that's exciting. Let's talk about private property. That's not very exciting. But it's exciting to the person who doesn't have private property. So lack of clear property title is a serious problem throughout the developing world. In some countries, 70% of the land, 50% of the land has no title. And of course, if you don't know who owns the land, people aren't going to take risks. You're not going to grow or start a business or build up anything if your land can be taken away from you. So without clean and secure title, people's land can be taken away. So all the work that they've put in is gone. And of course, who's the most vulnerable but the widow and the orphan? In China, for example, lack of secure property rights for rural farmers is a serious problem. Their land is often seized, expropriated quickly with low compensation so that a big business who's connected to the government can make some money. So without clear title, you are stuck in low productivity jobs. For example, like this lady. This is not a high productivity job. It's dignified. It's work. And she's creating the image of God just like we are. But it's not a high productivity job. And she can't get in a high productivity job if she doesn't own her property and she doesn't know who owns it. This is a 2014 economic freedom heat map. The greener the country, the better the property rights. The redder, the worse they are. There's a clear correlation between poverty and lack of property rights. And as I said, this comes out of the Christian tradition. It's presupposed in the Ten Commandments. It's in Genesis 23 when Abraham is negotiating for title to the plot of his burial space for his wife Sarah. We see it in the social encyclicals, most notably in Rerum Novarum. Now, ultimately, all things belong to God, and we are stewards. And so private property is not an end in itself. Okay? Private property is not an end in itself, but it's a means to human flourishing. And one of the things that Leo XIII points out is that property is so important not only for its economic value, but because it creates space for families to live out their freedom and their responsibilities. When you have space to live it out. Now, interestingly, brief aside here, while many Catholics may not be aware of the deep connection between property rights and the family, socialists are. They understand it very well. Everybody from Robert Owen to Karl Marx to Engels, the Fabians, Gramsci, the Frankfurt School, they all understand there are 3 primary obstacles to socialist reform: private property, religion, and, quote, this present form of marriage. These are not random, they're connected. The second one is rule of law. The second one is rule of law. So property rights is just the tip of the iceberg. It's part of a larger pattern of poor people not enjoying what many of us take for granted, that is access to the courts. So 2 of the big problems, one of them is corruption. Here again, this is the map of corruption. Notice we're not dark green in the United States. Okay. The United States is now, I think, in this ranking is the 12th freest economy in the world. It may surprise you that Canada is 6th. This is for economic freedom, okay? There's different kinds of freedom, but for economic freedom. So two problems they face are, one, they have little to no access to justice in the courts. There's according to the Research Foundation for Governance in India, there is a backlog of about 31 million cases that will take 320 years to be resolved. On average, it takes 20 to 25 years for justice to be served in the courts. And the cost of litigation is so extravagant that only rich people can do it. So if you are poor, illiterate, widow, or orphan, you are generally excluded. And of course, you all know that lack of justice is a serious, increasing problem for Christians in Islamic societies. And also in communist societies, places like North Korea. Number two, a second problem is that people are locked out of the formal economy. That is, they can't register their business without excessive burden. And let me give you a freedom map on business. That's business freedom. How easy it is to register a business. So from dark green all the way to red. Let me give you some examples. In Ghana, the business startup process takes 2 weeks. But obtaining necessary permits takes 200 days and still costs over twice the level of annual income. In India, it's very fast. It's only 25 days. But licensing requirements are 10 times the level of average income. Okay? Nigeria, 100 days and 30 times the level of average income. So let's put that in American, let's just say 10 times that. Let's say it takes you 100 days to start a business. You're going to go, how do you start a business now? You get online, you start a business. It takes you a day, an hour. You start a business, you're a sole or you're LLC, whatever it is. You set the work, you're ready to go, you pay a fee, and you're good. Let's say you are in a place where it takes 200 days to start a business. It takes you 200 days and 10 times average income, which means average income in the United States is about $40,000. That's $400,000, ladies and gentlemen, to start a business in American terms. So poor people are excluded. Hernando de Soto did a study. He set up a sewing shop with 2 sewing machines, and he got 4 student lawyers to go and register the business on the bus every day, 8 to 5, and do exactly everything that would be needed to start the business. Do you know how long it took them? 289 days to register a business. So poor people are excluded from the formal economy. They don't have clear property title. They can't register their business, so they're out. And these are obstacles to the natural right of freedom of association, which also comes out of the Christian tradition. Thomas Aquinas argued for the right of free association and against monopolies, as the Dominican sisters here know, in his defense of the mendicant orders in 1256, contra impugnates. The bishops were saying you can't teach, and Aquinas and Bonaventure made these arguments that the Franciscans and the Dominicans had the right to teach. And out of contra impugnates, the defense of the mendicant orders, this influenced Rerum Novarum's Leo XIII's work on the right of free association for unions. And so unions have the free association to associate, and so do businesses. And so this is a violation of that. And then the last one, the last institution of justice I'd like to talk about is freedom of exchange. This sounds strange because we often think that competition hurts the poor. But if we listen to the poor, we often hear a different story. They want access to markets and a chance to compete. And free exchange also is found in the Catholic tradition, especially in late scholastics in Salamanca and people like Saint Bernardino of Siena. And here's why free exchange is important. And this may shock you. Because think, wait a minute, doesn't competition hurt the poor? Aren't people being dominated by? Here's why. When governments get involved in regulating industry and making lots of complex rules regarding the economy. Now notice, if you've heard what I've said, I'm not arguing there's not a place for the state. I'm not arguing there's not a place for regulation. But when the government gets involved in regulating complex rules for the economy, who do you think writes the regulations? And who do you think influences them? Well, businesses with lobbyists. And so, these regulations almost always favor big business who employ the lobbyists. And the ones who get hurt are the smaller producers. And why free exchange is so important, or the reason why it's so important, is because poor people lack the political, economic, and social contacts to navigate a bureaucracy that's dominated by big business, powerful interest groups, and entrenched bureaucracy. We sometimes think, oh no, capitalism, hurts the poor. I actually don't like the word capitalism. It's a Marxist word, and we have capitalism here. It's oligarchic capitalism. I'm talking, and this is the problem in all over the world, that people are locked out. They need free exchange. For example, in Kenya, coffee growers can't sell directly to the market. They have to sell to the government board, who sets the price. So what the poor need is justice. They need rule of law, they need a clear framework to operate, and they need access to networks of productivity. They need ability to exchange their goods. And to do so requires a strong and effective state, but also a limited state. The problem is that in most poor countries, the state is neither effective or limited. Instead, it's invasive and extractive and burdensome. Of course, politics alone cannot solve the problem. There must be moral and spiritual transformation, a hungering for justice, and the prudence and persistence to cultivate it effectively. And there must be a deep, rich moral ecology. And this, of course, is going to be provided most by the church. Church specifically in churches, but also in universities and in schools across the world, this deep moral ecology. In their very well-regarded book, Why Nations Fail, Acemoglu and Robinson distinct between what they call inclusive political institutions and extractive political institutions. But the only way you're going to change extractive political institutions that take from the people into inclusive, that bring people in and include people, including the poor, you're not going to do that simply by politics and economics alone. You have to have a moral vision behind this. And so this, of course, is where evangelization and catechesis play an essential role. Christopher Dawson, the great historian, says that cultus, cult, religion, is the driving force of culture. And so we have a role as Catholics, as Christians, as educators, etc., in a whole host of areas to play a role in helping transform this moral ecology. And, of course, to be attentive that our charity doesn't hurt. I think one of the false ideas somehow is that poor people are being trampled or dominated by markets. Ladies and gentlemen, I would argue that they are being excluded from markets. And they are locked out. And they don't have the institutions of justice. And this is what we need to focus on. So there's always going to be poverty. There's always going to be suffering. And this will require human love. As Pope Francis said, economic growth alone is not going to solve our problems. Nor, as Benedict said, is the state going to solve all of our problems. We'll always have a need for almsgiving. There'll always be poor people who cannot help themselves and who need our care. We must care for the widow and the orphan in their distress. But for the majority of the world's poor, the problem is not one of charity or redistribution. The problem is that they lack the institutions of justice that enable them to create prosperity for their families and their communities. Thank you very much.